The casserole was burning. I know that's a strange detail to remember about the night my life fell apart. But that's the thing about grief. It doesn't care about your timing. It doesn't wait for you to pull dinner from the oven or turn off the stove or sit down somewhere soft before it hits you like a freight train. I was standing in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, stirring something I'd already stopped caring about, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen. Daniel. My brother. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken in 11 days. Not since Christmas, when he'd made that comment about my apartment. Still renting, Meg? Dad always said you never could commit to anything. And I'd smiled through it like I always did, then cried in my car for 20 minutes on the way home. I answered anyway. Because he was my brother. Because that's what you do. Meg. His voice was different, stripped of the usual smugness. It's Dad. I turned off the burner. Our father, Robert Allen Calloway, died at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in January, which felt wrong somehow. Dad was a Saturday kind of man. He liked slow mornings and bad coffee and the kind of silences that didn't need filling. He'd spent 31 years as a civil engineer, building bridges across the state of Ohio, and he had the hands to prove it. Rough, wide, permanently stained with something you could never quite wash out. He'd been sick for 8 months. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that moves fast and doesn't negotiate. I'd driven up to Dayton every other weekend. I'd sat with him through the treatments that didn't work and the side effects that did, held his hand through the nights when the pain got loud, and read to him from Louis L'Amour westerns because that's what he asked for, and you don't argue with a dying man about literature. Daniel visited twice. I counted. I shouldn't have, but I did. He had reasons, of course. Daniel always had reasons. The firm was going through a restructuring. His kids had school things. The drive from Chicago was brutal in winter. And honestly, Meg, Dad understands. You know how he is. He doesn't want people making a fuss. Dad never said that. Dad never said anything close to that. But I smiled and I nodded and I kept driving to Dayton every other weekend. The funeral was on a Friday. Small, the way Dad wanted. 30-something people in a chapel that smelled like wood polish and old hymns. Daniel gave the eulogy. He was good at it. Daniel was good at everything that happened in front of an audience. He talked about fishing trips I vaguely remembered and life lessons I mostly recognized. And twice he paused at exactly the right moment to collect himself. And the room loved him for it. I sat in the front pew and stared at my father's casket and thought about the last thing he said to me. It wasn't profound. He was tired, and the morphine was doing its work, and he'd grabbed my wrist with what was left of his grip and said, "Don't let them make you small, Meggie. You were never small." I assumed them was the world in general. I was wrong. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Monday at 9 a.m. at the office of Gerald Hoyt, my father's attorney, on the 4th floor of a building downtown Dayton that smelled exactly like you'd expect a 40-year-old law office to smell, like paper and carpet cleaner, and the ghost of 10,000 serious conversations. Daniel was already there when I arrived. He was wearing a suit, which struck me as odd for a Monday morning will reading with a total attendee list of 2. He had his phone out and he was typing something, and he looked up when I walked in and gave me the smile. The one that was just slightly too warm. The one that meant he wanted something. "You look tired," he said. "Dad just died, Daniel." "Right." He cleared his throat. "Right, of course." Gerald Hoyt was 70 if he was a day, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by human behavior sometime around 1987. He shook both our hands, offered coffee that neither of us wanted, and settled behind his desk with a manila folder that I found myself unable to stop staring at. "Before I begin," Gerald said, removing his glasses and cleaning them with the kind of deliberate slowness that made my stomach tighten, "I want to say that your father was a good man. I knew him for over 20 years. He thought very carefully about this document. Very carefully." He put his glasses back on. He opened the folder. and the room went quiet in a way that felt almost physical, like the air itself was holding its breath. Dad's estate wasn't enormous, but it wasn't nothing. The house in Dayton, paid off, worth somewhere around $340,000. A savings account, some stocks he'd held onto since the 90s. And the thing I hadn't known about until 3 months before he died, when he'd told me quietly on one of my visits, almost like a confession. A piece of land in eastern Tennessee. 40 acres on a ridge above a river, left to him by his own father, untouched for decades, recently appraised at somewhere in the neighborhood of $600,000 because a developer had started buying up the valley below and the land suddenly mattered in ways it hadn't before. The primary residence, Gerald began, in that measured attorney voice, along with all personal property contained therein, is to be sold, with proceeds divided equally between both children. I nodded. That was fair. That was what I'd expected. Gerald paused. He looked at the paper. Then he looked at me, and I realized in the half-second before he spoke that the look meant something. The Tennessee property, he said carefully, is bequeathed in its entirety to Daniel Robert Calloway. The clock on Gerald's wall ticked 3 times. I'm sorry, I said. Can you say that again? Gerald said it again. I heard every word. I just couldn't make them fit into any shape that made sense. I turned to look at my brother. Daniel was staring at the desk. Not at me, not at Gerald, at the desk, at some fixed point on the wood grain, with an expression I had never seen on his face before in 34 years of being his sister. It took me a moment to identify it. It was relief. I didn't cry in Gerald's office. I didn't yell either, which surprised me because I could feel something enormous and pressurized building behind my sternum. Instead, I sat very still while Gerald continued reading, something about timelines and estate procedures and a small separate bequest to a local animal shelter that made me think of my father so sharply it almost knocked the wind out of me. When it was over, Daniel touched my arm in the hallway. Meg, don't. I stepped back. Not right now. I didn't know, he said. I swear I didn't know he was going to. You're wearing a suit, Daniel. He stopped. You drove from Chicago on a Monday morning in January to hear a will read, I said, and you wore a suit. So please don't stand here and tell me you didn't know. I watched something move across his face. A flinch, almost. Gone before I could be sure of it. It's complicated, he said. If you just let me explain. But I was already walking toward the elevator, and the doors were closing, and the last thing I saw was my brother standing in that hallway in his suit with his hands open, like he was waiting for something to fall into them. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called the one person I always called when my life stopped making sense. She answered on the second ring. How'd it go? My best friend Carol asked. I stared at the concrete wall in front of me. I need you to find me a lawyer, I said. A good one. But here's the thing I didn't know yet. The thing nobody had told me. The thing that was sitting in a box in my father's closet in Dayton, waiting. Dad had written me a letter. And Daniel had already found it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and drop a comment below telling me what you think Daniel was hiding. Do you think he found the letter on purpose? Or is there something even bigger going on? And don't forget to turn on notifications, because in the next part, Meg heads to Tennessee to uncover a secret buried for decades. A secret that could change everything she thought she knew about her family. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.